in the West, we have numerous ways of holding people to account who commit excesses or make the wrong decisions. We've got political processes. We have elections, free and fair elections. We have an unmuzzled media. The problem is, in the Chinese case, none of that happens. China's leaders are above all laws because they are the law. There is no justice because they are the justice system. There is no free media because the media does what the politicians say, essentially.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Dr Alan Mendoza. Dr Alan Mendoza is an expert in foreign policy. He is part of the Henry Jackson Society, and we're going to be talking about the rise of China and Russia and whether there is a new Cold War going on between the West and the East. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much, Alan Mendoza, for joining us.
A pleasure to be here, as always.
What is the biggest threat facing the West right now?
Well, I think you can probably look at that in a number of different ways. You can look at it obviously short term, and then you can look at it sort of longer term. And I think I'd like to start from an interesting perspective. It was said to me once by Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA, who put it this way. He said, the world's been more dangerous in the past. And of course, he's referring to things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world could have literally been destroyed had there been an exchange between the Soviets and the Americans. But it's never been more complicated than today. And in reality, the complication has only increased in the last, say, decade since he said that to me. And I suppose what you're looking at is a series of different things. I mean, up until this point, Russia has obviously been a constant thorn in the side of the West. It has set itself against Western positions internationally. It has tried its best to interfere within our societies. It has tried to, act as a spoiler at the best, and also, tried to get advantage at the worst all over the world in terms of places. But I think in the last year, people's focus has gone further east. And if you're looking really at where the threat for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be, it's going to be China. And we can see that the scales have fallen from people's eyes on China. We're looking obviously economically what's going on. We're looking strategically from a human rights perspective, basically in all the areas where we thought that, say, 10 years ago, China might have been moving in our direction. It turns out that wasn't correct at all. And China's very much moved in its own direction and is making ever more aggressive steps for its way to be the international way too. So yes, China is where it's at right now.
Is there a new Cold War going on with us and China?
So it's an interesting question to consider whether this is a Cold War Mark II. Now, obviously, the first point is things never repeat themselves quite in the same way as beforehand. Now, I suppose the biggest difference between what you might have seen post-1945 to 1990 and sort of today is that China doesn't really have an ideology as such. The Soviets had an ideology. At the time, China did have an ideology under Mao, of course, and I suppose even under Deng. But today's China is not a communist state in any recognizable form from what, say, Karl Marx would have put down in his manifesto, essentially. What you are seeing, though, of course, are communist tactics of surveillance, of control, of coercion. In that way, it very much is a communist state still. But because you don't have this ideological challenge, it's not the case that the Chinese are trying essentially to get people to convert to their way of life and their way of doing things. And there isn't a race for influence in the way that it was post-45, when the world was essentially split into two, and you were either going into the Soviet camp either by force, of course, or by coercion, or occasionally, as in Cuba, through internal reasons, or you were with the free world. But yes, there is a divide between the free world and the unfree world today, and China is rapidly emerging as the leading force in what you might term the unfree world. And as such, it's not that it's trying to convert others to exactly the way it does things, but it's certainly looking to buy off other countries through trade deals or investment deals. It's looking to increase its sphere of influence. In its immediate neighborhood, it is very much on a land grab as well. We've seen, of course, the essential end of the one country, two systems idea in Hong Kong. I mean, that was always a different case anyway. But Taiwan has lots of reasons to fear right now about where China might covet next. We know in the South China Sea, there's all sorts of disputes going on. Other neighbors feel the pressure of China. So it's not an exact comparison to call it a Cold War as in post-45, but are we involved now very much in a competition for influence? Are we a strategic competitor with China? Yes, the answer is very much so, and that's how I think we have to look at this going forwards.
Can you talk a bit about the influence of technology on the relations with China? Because people have been talking about them hacking into, let's say, for example, a recent story are coronavirus vaccine labs in Oxford and Canada and the United States. Can you talk about the impact of technology on this, you don't call it a new Cold War, but let's say rising tensions between China and the West?
So I think the technological question is a really important one when it comes to analysing sort of China's goals, its ambitions, and the way it conducts itself internationally. The first thing to note is, of course, that China has been playing a long-term game. Ever since the time of Deng, essentially, what we have here is a country that is willing to bide its time, to grow in strength, and then to focus on areas where it could become a player at the very least, and from its goal, dominant in certain areas. And technology has been one of those places. In a sense, the sort of the promotion of Huawei through external deals, issues like that, demonstrates how China has played a 20-year game, essentially, in trying to promote companies in China to obviously take the lead in these sorts of areas. So they've always understood the importance of technology to what they would call the fourth industrial revolution. And China's goal has been to be at the forefront of the fourth industrial revolution, to be an indispensable pillar in the global economy in that kind of area. Now, accompanying that, of course, comes a variety of tools that you've been referring to in terms of hacking, in terms of attempting to conduct industrial espionage, all those sorts of issues. And again, it's quite clear that the Chinese have spent a lot of money and time investing in cyber capabilities that will firstly enable it to, frankly, steal designs off Western companies working in China. We've seen numerous examples of Chinese state sort of involvement in that kind of activity. But secondly, there's been this great concern about data collection, the sort of the safety of data, whether it is actual hacking or whether it is data going back to China in some way, shape or form to be used by the Chinese state. And again, that's been a sort of pivotal part of China's rise in the last decade, understanding how the data economy works, how reliant we are on data, how that information can be valuable to China in various ways, either through the conventional, as you say, the conventional way of hacking, but also just through analysis and understanding of how people operate in other places. So data, technology is a key part of the Chinese sort of gambit. And it has been a flashpoint for the last few years. We've known full well what's been going on. You mentioned the coronavirus vaccine case being just a very recent example, but there's lots more examples over the past 5-10 years where accusations have been leveled against China, which have never been satisfactorily explained. And this is, of course, an ongoing challenge because the more important the internet becomes, the Internet of Things, the data goes, the more there could be, if you like, dangers that the Chinese state gets a foothold in other societies that it should have no business in being within.
I want to elaborate on this point later on, but let's talk specifically about technology and the interaction between Western companies and the Chinese Communist Party. Recently, the CEOs of Microsoft, Apple, Facebook and Google were grilled by the US Congress. And one of the questions that they were all asked was about the influence of China and whether China steals intellectual property rights and whether China steals data from Western companies. And I believe only Mark Zuckerberg responded that China was a threat in that way. What do you make of the impact, or the relationship rather, between Western social media companies or internet companies, Silicon Valley, and China? Should we as consumers be worried that China is increasing their capabilities of harvesting our data? Maybe you could even talk about the app TikTok, which has recently been banned in India, and Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, is talking about banning it in the US. So can you talk about that relationship between Western technology companies, Chinese data, and whether we as consumers should be worried?
So it's a really complicated question, looking obviously at the relationship between various tech companies and the Chinese state. Now, firstly, of course, not everyone can access, some of these products in China. So you start off in a position where some of them are banned, essentially, or are not accessible without going through loopholes. So there's obviously, a divide there between those services that Chinese people can access and those they cannot. Now, the second point, of course, is why is it that everyone is so keen on doing business with China? Well, it's obvious. You've got over 1 billion people. It's a massive, massive market. And by the way, we ought to make clear very explicitly here, the problem people in the free world have with China is not with the Chinese people. The Chinese people are as much victims of the Chinese state as we are in terms of their intentions and ambitions. What we would love to see is a liberal democratic China, or a China which is responsive at the very least to what its people actually want, rather than what they are told and coerced into doing. And it's a very different kind of case in point. But the market is massive, and as a result, people are going to attempt to blur the lines as much as possible, because nobody wants to lose access to that size of market when you're in a dog-eat-dog commercial world. So, there's an understandable business reason why people don't want to kind of get on the wrong side of China, because the Chinese have shown as a state that they are able to turn off the taps if they want to. But the problem with this is that if you are engaged in any form of sort of essential business in China, you are obviously then falling foul of whatever surveillance laws the Chinese state may wish to introduce. If you look at where this leads ultimately, there is a great danger, is there not, that if data is being surveilled, if data is being captured in some way, shape or form, then your data or my data, if we are in some way using a service where there is a point of accessibility within China, can be accessed. Now, of course, that's not to say that Western companies are going to give access to China in that sense, but it becomes a very different case in point if you have a subsidiary in China, or in the case of, you mentioned TikTok, if you have a parent company that is a Chinese company. Because then two things happen. The first thing is, all companies of a certain size in China must have a Communist Party committee, an internal committee where basically the staff and the management are repeatedly indoctrinated into whatever the Chinese Communist Party want them to be talking about. And they have formal sessions. You can see all the stuff on the internet if you want to, it's all pretty open in terms of how this operates. And therefore, you've got a form of, if you like, Big Brother watching you, even within the company. But the second problem is that China has a set of data laws that say that if the Chinese state requests information from a private company, it doesn't matter how much the private company says it won't, cooperate with the Chinese state. If it wants to stay open, it will have to cooperate with the Chinese state. So the great fear is, and we'll never, essentially know what's going on because they're not exactly open with how they access data and how they do it. The great fear is that data is being sucked up, or would be sucked up, by the Chinese state, making requests to companies operating within its borders, who then have to comply. And that is why there is a sort of fear about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on the whole business climate in China, and of course the relationship of that into the tech world that we are of course immersed in ourselves. So this explains the touchy nature of why certain countries have decided to start banning companies that are connected strongly to China, because in their view, there are security dangers that I've just explained that mean that data is not secure and that it can be accessed by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's essentially why you're seeing bans occurring.
A lot of people in the West don't understand China's motivations. Can you explain what China actually wants?
Well, it's interesting that some people don't really understand what China wants, because China wants what all other countries want, essentially, which is to improve, if you like, their position within global markets, within the world power stakes, if you like, and to bring greater prosperity. The difference, of course, is that its way of doing this stands antithetical to what we in the West believe and how we operate. So, in essence, it starts from a position of that we are competitors, because they're looking to enhance their global position, and that inevitably means that ours will be diminished if they're able to do that. The Chinese like to always say to you, there's a win-win. We can grow and you can grow. But it turns out that if you look at how China grows and the way it grows, and if you look at its sort of schemes such as Belt and Road, a lot of what it does is provide very cheap investment loans into countries. And then when the countries default because they've been offered far too much money for what they can actually afford, the Chinese then seize assets and start taking over interesting bits of countries. So Sri Lanka is a famous case where a whole port was taken over by the Chinese, essentially, in payment for a default of a debt. So in essence, it's very colonialist in mentality. And what the Chinese are trying to do, they're trying to boost what they're doing. And it's almost like a 19th century, imperial approach to how you improve your power and increase your power. It is not simply a benign, let's trade, let's come along in this way. There is a way of, if you like, seizing assets along with that also works. So this is in itself an interesting starting point. But the second issue that comes along with it is that there's a values challenge as well. Now, the Chinese are very aware that their system is very different to our system in terms of human rights, in terms of civil rights, in terms of surveillance, all the issues that we would have great problems with. The Chinese state, of course, wishes maximum control in that sort of way. So when it comes to its system, it's very keen to protect it and to avoid criticism of it as well. And so what you see internationally is a concerted attempt by China to play into positions that tend to be, again, hostile to those of the West in certain parts of the world where we are trying to achieve something in the name, if you like, of either strategic position or values, or the two together, because it feels its values are under threat. So China's basic line is always, we must not intervene in other countries. Okay, that's the sort of line the Chinese will put out to you at the UN, which is why they vote against most interventions. What's interesting about it, of course, is that China is hypocritical on this. When it comes to their interventions in other countries, they're very happy to push forward and to try and promote what they're doing. We've seen in recent months and years, obviously, the South China land grabs, where they have contested territory with other countries. We've seen in India border clashes where, again, there's a territorial demarcation dispute going on there, where the Chinese want bits of India to be, and the border to be maintained where they think the border is rather than where India thinks the border is. And of course, we've seen in their activities in other countries how they have essentially bought off certain key interests in order to preserve positions in that sort of way. So what I'd say is China's position is absolutely rational from the point of view of a country that is trying to promote itself and trying to promote its own power and its market share. But because it is rational doesn't mean it's sensible for us to accept it. On the contrary, we have to understand that it's a challenge to us on a commercial level, it's a challenge to us on a strategic level, and it's a challenge to us on a moral level as well. And because of all those three issues, that's why we have to be aware of what China's doing and why we have to resist it as much as possible.
Listen, I want to talk about that last point you made, the moral activities of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese regime. I don't want to skirt around these issues. Last week I interviewed a Uyghur Muslim who was in China until 2000, and they came over to the UK, and they talked about what they called a genocide going against the Uyghur Muslim population. Various estimates say that 3 million people are in concentration camps in Xinjiang in China. They're being tortured, they're being sterilized. The Chinese government called them re-education camps. With that in mind, what kind of regime is China? Is it a malign power? Is it a completely benign power? Is it, should we be worried about these issues going forward?
So the whole issue of the nature of the Chinese state and what the Chinese Communist Party seeks to achieve is of absolutely pivotal interest to, I think, British people and indeed all of us in the West. Because if you look at how China has conducted itself internally, actually since the beginning of the communist state, it is an extraordinary lesson in the excesses of ideology at the start, and then the sort of brutal desire for control at all times, and the snuffing out of any potential threats, which you've seen time and time again. So you start with Mao. Mao, the great, the founder of the Chinese Communist state, essentially, how many millions of victims of Mao were there in, the famine, for example, that his policies brought to China? I mean, estimates have ranged as high as north of 20 million people killed by Mao's crazy, sort of communist ideas. Then you had the Cultural Revolution, where he completely upended the country, upended its history, had parents denounced by their children, teachers denounced by their students, people tortured, killed, all the rest of it, again, in pursuit of ideology, and the way this sort of worked. You go forward again to Tiananmen Square, when the brutal crushing of demands by students and others to have, a free society, or at least more freedoms than what they had enjoyed to that point. And you go on and on. You can see the suppression of the Falun Gong, the suppression of Christians. What you're now seeing, as you said, the genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province. And you get the impression that this is a nasty, brutish state, that whenever it sees anything that is different, anything that is not stultifyingly, in conformity with its own vision of how it operates, it will seek to crush by the most brutal methods possible. And Xinjiang is just the ultimate example of this, because what you're seeing there is indeed an attempt to suppress Uyghur identity full stop, in some cases literally through the sterilization of women and how pregnancies are being treated over there. But then again, as you pointed out as well, you've got labor camps, horrific images of shaven-headed men being forced off to be re-educated, to use a terminology. But we all know that that sort of terminology is pretty similar, is it not, to resettlement in the East, as the Nazis used to say, as they were, carting European Jews off to their deaths. So it's not, it's not an exact parallel. This is not, 1939 to 45. But 1939 to 45 did not start with Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the end. It started with Dachau in 1933. And when you end up with a prison state mentality, that creates the space for further excesses to follow. And what you've also got, of course, on top of this is the unbelievable surveillance state the Chinese have created. We talked about technology earlier. The reality is that if you live in China today, you are monitored constantly. What you say can be picked up. If you write on anything, on your phone or on a computer, it can be picked up. The reality is, and your locations are watched, where you go, all plays out. And we know the Chinese have been trialing schemes whereby if you end up having engaged in dissent in some form against the state, even you're not even one of the persecuted communities, but an ordinary Chinese person who isn't marked out for some kind of re-education, and you actually fall into this category of criticizing the Communist Party, your privileges start getting taken away, and life becomes deeply unpleasant for you. Essentially, it's the Orwellian nightmare coming true. Orwell's vision of 1984, the Big Brother state watching everything you do and policing your thought. That's where China is heading very, very quickly, using technology to sort of support its aims in this way.
Now listen, I've done a lot of interviews about China in the last few months, and every single one of them, I think, I'm already predicting, seeing it in my mind, the people in the comments section of this video saying, this is all propaganda from the West, none of this is true. I did the interview, as I mentioned earlier, with the Uyghur Muslim last week. They said she was an American propaganda, actor. So look, I'm not, and a lot of people say that the West isn't perfect. We invaded Iraq or whatever we did wrong, and no one's perfect. But I think it's perfectly honest and true to talk about these issues going on in China. And one of the questions that I was really keen to ask you about was, a new report came out recently that was entitled China's Capturing of the Elite in British Politics. Now, this was a report written by a former spy and various other people. I have to mention Christopher Steele, who also wrote a report back in 2016 about Donald Trump and Russia. I have to mention that, where basically they claim that the Chinese state has been able to offer various benefits to British members of the elite, whether it's politicians or business people or whatever, giving them places on Chinese companies' boards or various other ways to, in return, basically have their support for this regime. Now, you've just described just some of the things that the regime has been up to over the last few decades. How is it that we've come to a situation where members of the British elite are allegedly being paid off by this regime with a history that we've just talked about, and basically, in my eyes, they've got away with it?
Well, you've opened up an interesting can of worms. Look, we're not going to get into specific accusations because that dossier is very interesting, but none of us, I don't think, have seen the evidence behind the claims. So I think it would be helpful to see the specifics behind the claims to understand that. But in a sense, you don't need to know the specifics. You don't need to know that X was offered this money or Y was offered a place on this board, etc. Because you've hit the nail on the head in terms of understanding that this is a bad regime. These are bad people that anyone who works for them is getting into bed with. Now, to a certain point, everyone understands the need for trade and the need for investment and the need for business. We all get that. All of us want to be more prosperous, do we not? And part of that is, of course, trading with the world's biggest population and an industrial superpower, essentially. We all understand that in that kind of way. But there's a difference between trading with it and then, if you like, getting into bed with the regime in various forms and actually arguing that it's a good thing that China is improving its position in the world. It isn't. It's not a good thing because of the morality of what this regime is and the morality of what it's about and the challenge it poses to us in this way. And I think what we're seeing is, in many cases, the extreme dangers of moral relativism creeping in here. People going and saying, you know what? The Chinese aren't so bad. There are problems, we've got problems. You alluded to, for example, our own human rights issues that we've grappled with and faced with. On a balance, yeah, they may be slightly worse than us, but actually, we're not without sin in this sort of argument as well. And the answer to that is really simple. The answer is, in the West, we have numerous ways of holding people to account who commit excesses or make the wrong decisions. We've got political processes. We have elections, free and fair elections. We have an unmuzzled media who are willing to chase after politicians or others who people feel have done wrong and hold them to account. We have a judicial system that is impartial and fair and where you can access recourse or, justice if you feel you have been impugned in some way or an injustice has occurred. And we've seen time and time again cases occurring where our states have had rulings overturned or critical issues have been revealed to the public and actions have occurred as a result of that. The problem is, in the Chinese case, none of that happens. China's leaders are above all laws because they are the law. There is no justice because they are the justice system. There is no free media because the media does what the politicians say, essentially. And as a result, you have no ability to hold that state to account. And as a result, there is a moral difference between us. We are free and they are unfree. We are free with all the problems and all the benefits that brings, and they are unfree with all the problems and benefits that brings. But to suggest we're on the same plane and to say that this is a regime that we should be welcoming with open arms because they're just like us is fundamentally untrue. They are very different to us in terms of the mentality towards their own people and towards others that they are willing to engage in. And they are a direct competitor in terms of values and how they see the world. And if their vision of how the world should be wins out, then that will be a huge issue for our societies as well. And we will lose essentially a good number of the freedoms we already enjoy because of the closing down of the free and democratic space that we have come to understand is the best way for humanity to flourish. And that is why this is such a touchy topic. I'd like to say to the people who work with, Chinese state companies, why are you doing it? You're essentially furthering the goals of this regime. We understand trade. We understand we want to, work with, we traded with the Soviet Union, for goodness sakes, during the Cold War even. But we crucially made human rights part of that trade deal and discussions with the Soviet Union. It's about time we were confident enough in our own values, in the success and strength historically of the free and democratic world, to be able to once again look China in the eye and say to us, okay, we'll trade with you, but don't ever think for 1 minute you're on the same moral level as we are. You're not, and guess what? You're in the wrong. And until we're prepared to do that, I think we will have a lot more people willing still to work with the Chinese state in various ways in order to assist them in their market strategy.
And by the way, to be fair to the Chinese regime, this is what they would say. They would say that over the last few decades, their economy has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. They've had huge economic successes, which has obviously brought a lot of benefits to people in China, and that's their that's their side of the argument. So it's worth, to be fair and balanced, it's worth to point out that that's probably would be their response, and obviously the Chinese regime would deny any human rights abuses in the places that we've been talking about as well.
Well, the latter part's just a lie, and we know it's a lie, and we've proved the evidence. But the former part, you're quite right. And I said earlier, it's a perfectly rational strategy for the Chinese state to be following, because there are indeed domestic concerns, if you're a Chinese leader, that you want to sort of satisfy. And the Chinese have, the leadership has made it clear that their goal, their number one goal, is China as an economic force in the world, which will lift, of course, the population into ever higher GDP brackets. Prosperity will follow, and their gamble has always been that people will tolerate the lack of freedom if they see economic benefits along the way. Basically, that's a challenge. But the converse of that is, and this is where it becomes very interesting, we tend to think of China as this sort of, behemoth that's not going to ever crack and crumble. The reality is they're always just one bad set of GDP figures away from unrest on the streets, because the moment expectations fail to be met, the moment people start to go, you're not delivering for us in the way that you said you would, that you told us you would as part of this pact that you have made on our behalf. We didn't really get a say, but you've made it and said you'll get economic growth, we'll lift you up, but in response you'll have no political freedom or civil rights in that sort of way. Then people will start getting upset. And so the challenge for China is always to keep on growing before it's overcome by economic issues. And then there are other problems as well. The demography, the one child per family policy has completely skewed China's population pyramid. And as a result, there is a big question mark, and it's a constant question mark, about whether China gets old before it gets seriously rich, i.e. Western levels of richness. Because if it does, and if you're finding a sort of a population pyramid looking like that, which is supporting a vast number of older people, how does that work in terms of your system? Though that's both a good thing and a bad thing, it's a double-edged sword. The good part of that, of course, is it means that the communist regime may well crumble at some point. The bad part is, as we've seen in Russia, when you have an authoritarian state which feels under pressure, that's when it tends to want to lash out to create external enemies in order to divert people's attentions. And that is a great fear, that if there is instability in China, the Chinese will respond, the Communist Party will respond by manufacturing disputes abroad in order to save the day, if you like, domestically.
Now, this next question is a bit of a curveball question, and I think it's going to be my final one on China, and then we can move on to some other issues. Recently, the US government, earlier this year, released some documents showing some unidentified flying vehicles. I think it was the US Navy showed some videos of some kind of, I don't know, we don't know what they are, basically. Marco Rubio, who's a US politician, a Republican, said that, or he implied that maybe this was some kind of Chinese or Russian technology. Now, I don't know how much you've closely sort of followed that story, but can you comment on perhaps how far China has got in the technological race? Are they over the West? Have they gone past us in various ways, or where are they at in terms of technology?
So I can't comment about that particular story because I just don't know enough about what that might have been. But it's an interesting one, looking at the sort of military technology side of thing, which I think is what you're kind of referring to. Look, China spends a lot of money on defense, obviously, and it's trying to build up its armed forces. The reality is, of course, it's nowhere near yet the level of sophistication as the US has. That doesn't mean that in certain places, though, the Chinese haven't developed serious capabilities. One thing the Chinese have been trying to do for a long time is blunt the US ability to intervene in the Pacific Ocean or the South China Sea, whatever you want to term that space, blunt their ability to just act there at whim. And they've developed a lot of, or put a lot of effort into developing anti-carrier technology in particular, anti-aircraft carrier technology. So obviously we haven't seen that ever being tested in a war or a conflict. But the suspicion is the Chinese have developed technology to a certain point that could cause the US, for example, some problems were there to be a naval battle between the two sides in some way, shape, or form. So yes, I think it's not a question that across the board China's technology is superior to the West, because we've had a head start of many, many years in terms of technology and how our systems have developed and getting to that next stage. And of course, the American defense budget still towers above all else. But the Chinese are playing a catch-up game, and they're looking, as I said, to find chinks in the American armor where they can kind of insert a missile here or a attack there, which would kind of damage the Americans' ability to operate in the way the Americans would want to in any kind of conflict there. So it is interesting to sort of think about how China develops. And the longer this period goes on for, the longer China is able to invest and build up its budgets and forces, the more likely it is you're going to see some really top-level Chinese technology appearing. That time is not right now, but it will be within the next decade or two, because the amount of money they're spending will justify it. But there's also a key difference. One big difference. The American military is quite battle tested. The US, if you think about it, it's been involved in conflicts around the world since 1941, basically. Hardly a year goes by without some US forces in some places. China has not in quite the same way. There's been an odd skirmish here and there. But in recent times, there's been no major battles involving the Chinese in any way. And a lot of the sort of military capability you develop is through actual combat and through that sort of training and those experiences. On those terms, we in the West maintain a significant advantage over China because they are completely unbattle tested. So, were there to be some kind of conflict between the West, which I don't think there will be, of course, but were there to be, I do think the West would come out on top and fairly easily. But the longer this kind of drags on for, the more the Chinese will be able to build up their forces, and the more likely they are to be able to hold their own in any kind of conflict going forwards. So it is an interesting one to ponder, but right now the West maintains a qualitative and quantitative advantage.
So you were part of the people who founded the Henry Jackson Society, and I'm going to frame it now. You may choose to frame it differently, but I think that your views on foreign policy have been relatively anti-establishment in various ways. Now, you could say that it's gone against, let's say, for example, recent, David Cameron's policy towards China is probably very different to the one that you would pursue. That's kind of a Western establishment that you may be disagreeing with. And I'm sure there are various regimes over the years who you have in part angered. Let's talk about Russia, Iran, China's another one, through your various reports on human rights or whatever the issue is. I'm sure that that's caused a stir in many ways. Can you talk about what it's been like running the Henry Jackson Society as a think tank, and what kind of pushback you've experienced over the decades, over the years, from these various regimes when you publish these reports, because they must have a really big impact in some of those countries?
Well, I'm pleased to say it's not quite decades yet. I'm already sort of 15, 16 years in. So it's
almost decades.
I haven't done this still, although now you think about it, it is quite considerable. But look, the reality is when we started the Henry Jackson Society, it was a group of students and academics in Cambridge coming together who were just motivated by a key idea, which is that even back in 2004-05, that we could see there was a big divide in the world between democracies, the free world, and the unfree world. And to us, it was obvious that just as in the Cold War time, the problems in the world were being caused by unfree countries who were seeking to destabilize their neighborhoods or to advance their interests. So it was true in the contemporary age as well, and it has stayed true during that period. You've seen a number of different countries like Russia and China in particular at the top end, but also pernicious ideologies like radical Islam appear during that time and challenge what we, who we are and what we believe in the West. And so I suppose the first part of this is to look back and go, there were actually, you said it was anti-establishment. There were three things I'd say we were well ahead of the curve. where the establishment was concerned, and we were not shy about making our views felt. The first was Russia. You'll recall that when people, were saying things like, I looked into Putin's eyes and I, could see the soul of a man I could do business with or whatever. Well, we were very much with the people like John McCain who said, no, I looked in his eyes and thought KGB in that sort of way. And to us, it was always obvious from the early days that Russia under Putin, if Putin was crushing liberty and democracy in Russia domestically, he was obviously always likely to do the same internationally, and thus it proved. But we were ahead of that and pointed that out and wanted to make clear to people this was not a friend from the early days. Radical Islam, again, a second point. It seemed obvious to us that if you have here an ideology that comes out of religion and which is potentially, you've got a mass number of people who could be influenced by it, because it stems from religious sources, then you have a problem. You've got a real problem. You've got to take it seriously. You've got to fight that ideology. You've got to point out it is extremist. It can't be brushed under the carpet. You've got to tackle it. And when a lot of people were unwilling to do that and were willing to argue, well, no, it's a minority, it's a misinterpretation, we were obviously keen to show, no, I'm sorry, you've got to tackle it from what it is, which is a part of Islam, not one that most Muslims would want to be part of, or we'd want people to be part of, but it exists and it has to be kind of defeated in the realm of ideas and the realm of action. So again, that was unpopular at the start, and a lot of people didn't like that. And then when it came to China, again, we'd pointed out very early on that once again, the same issue with Russia. You can't treat people domestically badly and then think this regime is going to behave well overseas. It never goes like that. And we've seen that time and time again over history. So once again, when others were willing to rush and, open up the golden age, as you sort of alluded to with Cameron and co, we pointed out, but who are these people? What is this regime all about? It's not a golden age. It's not like doing business with the US, a fellow democracy. This is a nasty regime who are likely to be nasty internationally and to have, bad goals in that way. So we got those things right, I'd say, early, and that, pulls some nose out of joint. And of course, you're right to suggest that's also led to, some focus within those countries upon us. Russia, we've had TV programs dedicated to us, delightful to hear that we're such a big thing on Russian TV, primetime debates about some of our reports and discussions, and they've tried to obviously, debunk what we have said. Hacking attempts, obviously, all sorts of interesting attempts to break into our systems by state-sponsored attackers, as we've been told by various security services. So you get that. The Chinese are not obviously happy with the line we've taken. I've been sort of summoned numerous times by our friends in the Chinese embassy in London to talk about an exchange of views, as we like to call them, a candid exchange of views over what goes on there. We've been denounced in various, I think, a couple of press conferences by official spokespeople in China, talking about the organization. And of course, look, on the serious end, we've had death threats against staff members from radical Muslim organizations. We've had some other countries within the Middle East, again, targeting our systems, trying to make claims about what we're really about. And I like to say, if those are your enemies, you're doing a good thing, basically. If it is people like that who are trying to shut you down and trying to, fight back against you, it shows you, firstly, you're having a major impact, because they wouldn't bother if you weren't having an impact. And number two, it shows that you're on the right track, because you can define people very much by who stands up against them and who argues against them. And the same, by the way, is true in domestic politics. It was a source of entertainment during the Corbynite days when, Corbyn and co would denounce us. Well, you know what? Fine, because your foreign policy outlook is dangerous, Mr. Corbyn. This has always been dangerous. And as a result, we have no issue in you calling us out, just as we will call you out when you're wrong.
Just very briefly, do you ever accept those invitations from the Chinese embassy?
Oh, absolutely. I am very happy to speak to anyone who wants to speak to us. We even have offered the Chinese ambassador a platform at HJS to come and be interviewed, and let's talk about your policies. This is not about putting one point of view across, as we've trying to discuss in this interview. Even we're very happy to talk to people from sort of countries who we think have done wrong in the world, and to hear their point of view and why they think we're wrong in exchange. But the key to it is debate and discussion. Unsurprisingly, the ambassador has been very busy and has been unable to accept our invitation. But it's nice to be able to reiterate it on camera now. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Ambassador, we'd be delighted to host you and have that debate.
The same applies over here at The Sun. Let's finish off the interview by talking about the recent report published by the government, the British government, to do with Russia, the Russia report. Now, this accuses the British government it's published by a group of MPs, I should say. This accuses the British government of basically taking their eye off the ball in terms of the threat from Russia that they've imposed, that they've had an impact over the last few years in terms of interference in our internal affairs, elections, and various oligarchs here in London and things like that. Do you think Britain has been basically sleepwalking on this issue with the Russian threat?
So I think for a long time, people were willing to turn a blind eye to Russia and its activities in terms of corruption, in terms of abuses of various kinds, and in terms of what sort of Russian money was doing in London in that sort of way. And again, I think it was a case of, look, there were financial interests that wanted, if you like, Russian money to flow here. The property market, for a long time had a big boost from the top end, where people on absurdly low salaries were buying beautiful London properties. Nobody was batting an eye as to how that might be the case. Where was their source of income, all the rest of it. I think over time we have, the people concerned about this have shamed the authorities in various ways into stopping these practices. Now you have to have source of funds proof. You've got to have, kind of evidence of, of what's happened in terms of your impact, income in that sort of way. And, from a political point of view, people are very wary now of Russian propaganda outlets like Russia Today or Sputnik, things like that, in a way that when they first came on the scene, there were people willing to give them the sort of burden of doubt. My issue with the report isn't that anything in it is wrong. All I think is that we kind of knew all the stuff that was in the report already. We knew that Russia was trying to influence us. We knew the length they were willing to go. We got evidence of it. And the good news of it is that actions have been taking place over the last 3 to 4 years to stop it from happening. And one of the most important, of course, is a passage of the Magnitsky legislation, essentially, which, as you'll know, is human rights legislation that allows the British government to slap on sanctions on individuals who are involved in committing human rights offences, named after Sergei Magnitsky, who was, of course, famously Bill Browder's lawyer, who was murdered while he was in Russian custody. And of course, there's been a global campaign to bring this sort of thing in. So it took a long time for us to get there, though, but we did get there in the end. The British government did bring this legislation in place, and we've now used it as well on human rights abusers. So the reality is that much of, in a sense, it's like closing the stable door once a horse has bolted already. The horse was out there. We've been trying to catch the horse. We've been doing various issues already in that, and everyone's aware of the extent of Russian influence. I think the interesting part of this is now looking beyond Russian influence to how others are trying to influence in the UK as well. And again, China's an obvious example as to tactics it has been trying to employ in similar ways, whether it is in social media or whether it is through its sort of attempts commercially. But there are other countries as well who see London as a playground, if you like, for their own spats of various kinds, and who seek to exert influence through what happens. And I think the sooner we get to grips, full stop, with contemporary attempts to influence our society through technology, through sort of sweetheart deals, however it might work, the better it will be for people here to understand what's actually happening when it comes to foreign agents trying to influence our societies. So, I welcome that report in the sense that it opens up a set of questions to be resolved. I'm pleased to see we are resolving most of them, but we need to go well beyond just Russia and look at other foreign agents as well to stop their activity.
And on that, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Alan Mendoza.
A great pleasure as always. Hope to speak to you again soon.